Hi everybody, this is Pastor Susan and welcome to day 4 of our week-long devotional series on God's compassion as we look at God's compassion that is with us in our grief. Today's story has a very unusual ending, but I want us to think about this story in terms of God's presence with us in our grief. There is not a time when God is not with us, but especially when we are going through grief, there is, in God's compassion for us, there's a special experience of God's presence as we open ourselves to God that is reserved for this time in our lives when we really are struggling with loss. And the story that we're going to be telling today from the Gospel of Luke is about a woman who is the epitome of the poor during her time. She is a widow. She has one son, and she loses him. And this is a story about restoration, but it is also a story of compassion. So listen to these words from John chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd were with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and he said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and he touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them. They glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. When the Lord saw this woman who had lost everything, she not only lost her husband, she lost her son, her only son, the one who was tasked with caring for her. For remember, in the days of Jesus, women were not those who had property or had wealth. It was a very patriarchal or male-centered society, and so the fact that she was a widow meant that she had to be cared for by her son, and this was her only son, and this son had died. And it said, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And then he reached out to the son and he raised him from the dead. And all the people, it said, were afraid, or they had fear. And again, we talk about what the fear of the Lord is. It is this deep respect and awe and reverence. And immediately they began to say Jesus was a prophet. He had amazing power that was manifested through this resurrection from the dead. Again, meeting a need where it happened. As I said, this is an extraordinary story, but it represents the compassion of God. And I'm not saying that this story is something that would be repeated over and over again. It was unusual circumstances, and miracles don't happen every single day in this respect. Miracles happen a lot of times in different ways. But we hear from this story about God's compassion for us and the provision that God makes for us. I think it's also amazing in the story that it talks about the fact that this woman had a crowd of people around her. She did have a support system. And so I am grateful today not only for Jesus's healing of this person who had died and this restoration of a family unit, but also the representation that it makes of a community that is gathered around in love to support each other through times that are difficult. God is a God who grieves with us and who wills for us to reach out and to receive healing and strength from Him. If you're grieving today, you've lost a loved one recently, my prayer is with you that you might know this one who loves you beyond measure, who cries with you, who has compassion for you. And as you are willing to allow that compassion to pour over you, you will receive your healing. May it be so. Amen and amen.